And welcome to the Daily Climate Show. Coming up, drought and looming famine in Somaliland, a warning from the UN of potential mass death of children. Going in the right direction, but not fast enough. Record investment in renewable energy. And bring back the bees, the EU plan for nature recovery. Hello and welcome to the Daily Climate Show here on Sky News, where we report on the impacts of the climate crisis, hearing from those worst affected and follow the people working on the big solutions. Well, we start today with a stark warning about drought and famine in the Horn of Africa. If an intervention doesn't happen quickly, the United Nations Children's Fund says it's inevitable that many children will die in the coming months. In April, the self-declared Republic of Somaliland issued an emergency appeal for assistance for the 1.5 million people affected by the drought. The number of people in need is up 85% since the start of the year. Well, more than 100 schools have had to shut their doors due to the lack of water. And all across Somaliland and Somalia since the start of the year, there's been more than 3,000 cases of cholera and more than 6,000 cases of measles. Our international affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn, reports from rural villages in the self-declared Republic of Somaliland. And a warning, this report does contain images of distressed children.
On what looks like the surface of Mars, the worst drought for 40 years is taking hold. On land parched dry, people are struggling to survive or fleeing. Villages are emptying. In this one, 2/3 of people have already left. But some are too sick to move, like little Decca, 7 weeks old and severely malnourished. Her mother, Ayan, was also weak and struggled to speak. The family is running out of food. Their livestock has either died or stopped producing milk, like so many others here. Under baking heat, we met Ismail Mahmoud, who's lived here 90 years and says it's the worst drought he's ever witnessed.
guban iyo oogo iyo meel walba jirta waxaanu nidaahnaa wixii aanu soo maray abaar ahaa tana nagaga xun.
The deeper inland, the worse the drought. We drove by one homestead after another, deserted by families as the drought claimed their livestock.
And this is the main homestead. And probably they had children here. They gave birth to children here, 1, 2, 3 kids here. And
so you only leave if you have to?
Yeah, that is, it's the worst, in the worst situation. Yeah. And that is the last thing they can do, leaving their homestead.
They had to leave, they had no choice?
They had no choice, surely, they had no choice.
Outside one village, we met the governor of the region. Its people desperately need help, he told us. But the drought, he says, is being made worse by the war in Ukraine. It may look busy, but in the only big flour mill in Somaliland, they are running out of grain. Russia's blockade of Ukraine means they haven't had a shipment for 3 months. Its silos are emptying, and they may soon have to stop grinding grain.
Maybe everybody will lose his job. Also, Somali population, how they will get food. In general, this war affected us as a company. As a company, we are affected by this war. That's it.
If the mill shuts down, Somaliland will lose its main source of bread. It's hard to think of a more graphic illustration of the impact of Russia's war in Ukraine on developing nations. One of the world's poorest countries literally running out of grain. Its silos standing empty, while there is millions of tons of grain stuck in Ukraine, unable to get out. War and drought now haunt Somaliland and the entire Horn of Africa, threatening a humanitarian disaster. UNICEF says without action, the mass death of children will be inevitable. And the people here know it's coming. At the last of 3 wells in this village to have any water left, camel herders had dire predictions. The drought is bad, he says, but worse is on its way. Dominic Waghorn, Sky News, Somaliland.
Well, let's get some more of today's climate news for you now. And the European Commission has proposed legally binding targets to restore nature across the European Union in an attempt to recover plunging wildlife populations. There'll also be individual targets to help specific species and habitats, for example, pollinators like bees and farmland birds, and to restore rivers back to their natural courses. Well, the proposals would require EU countries to restore nature to 20% of EU land by 2030. The United States continues to face an intense heat wave. Temperatures are likely to reach nearly 40 degrees Celsius today in cities like Atlanta and Charlotte as the heat wave moves eastwards. The unusually hot conditions will likely remain until the end of the month. The extreme heats are likely to test the country's energy supply too, with one power grid operator saying it's taking steps to ensure supplies aren't disrupted as people turn on their air conditioning. Here, household energy bills in the UK are likely to increase by around £2.7 billion to cover the cost of the 28 energy suppliers that have gone bust in the last year. And this doesn't take into account the collapse of bulb energy, which might land another multi-billion-pound charge on consumers. The National Audit Office has said that while the failures were caused by the massive changes in the energy market, the regulator Ofgem is also partly to blame. Now, Europe needs to prepare for the possibility of Russia cutting off its gas supplies completely. That's according to the head of the International Energy Agency. Fatih Birol's comments come as his agency's report shows record amounts of spending is going into clean energy sources, but not enough to plug the gap in supply caused by the Ukraine war. We'll discuss all of this in a minute, but let's first take a look at the details of this IEA report. Investment in clean energy was quite flat despite the Paris Agreement in 2015, when countries vowed to move away from fossil fuels. But since 2020, that spending has actually grown by 12%, and it's estimated to rise even more, with the IEA expecting clean energy investment to nearly $1.5 trillion this year. Well, this is mostly spending on renewable power like wind and solar, but more money is also going into emerging technologies. Investment in battery energy storage is set to double to almost $20 billion this year. Plus, commercial-scale carbon capture projects are also taking off, with 130 announced in 20 different countries in 2021. And of course, the war in Ukraine is also having an impact as Europe turns away from Russian oil. Companies focused on hydrogen, which is also a clean energy source, of course, are now raising $500 million a year. Well, joining me now is Jill Duggan from the Environmental Defence Fund in Europe. Thanks very much for joining us on the Daily Climate Show. I want to talk to you first about Fatih Birol's comments, Jill. He's actually saying that because of this potential disruption of gas supply from Russia, countries really should start looking to keep their nuclear power plants that they might have potentially decommissioned open for longer. What do you make of that?
Well, I think we do need to look at all available sources of energy. As you've already demonstrated in earlier stories, people are facing very high energy costs this year, and nuclear does have the benefit of being carbon-free, although it does have other costs and issues associated with it. So I think that's one of the sources that needs to be borne in mind. I thought the report was very interesting, though, for showing that increase in investment in clean energy, actually a lot of that increase was taken up by increased costs. So it wasn't all translating into that amount of clean energy that the investment would suggest.
It's worrying, though, isn't it? Because the statistics right now are seemingly so much better than they were post-Paris Agreement, as we just saw in that graphic. But it's simply still not enough. What more do you think needs to be done and can be done?
I think one of the stark things that comes through in the report is the difference between developed and developing countries. So most of that investment in clean energy is happening in developed countries and China. And the developing countries' investment is very much, clean energy investment is very flat. They don't have the same resources. And if we really want to tackle this climate crisis, we will have to make sure that those finances flow to those countries in order to allow them to increase their renewable energy sources.
And
I think the other thing that
finances,
the war in
Jill, go towards in terms of the types of energy sources renewable? I mean, there's a lot of focus on solar and wind, but beyond that, we just mentioned hydrogen and other sources. Can you tell us about what types of energy needs to be invested in?
Well, I think all of the above, but I think one of the things I would like to point out is we need to be very aware when we're making these investments that not everything is what it appears at first glance. So hydrogen can play an important role, but even green hydrogen made from renewable electricity, can have a global warming impact if we don't make sure that we use it effectively. So none of these is a silver bullet. We need to think about what we're doing. And with renewable sources, it's very important. They're very place-based. You know, if you've got a lot of sun, then solar is obviously the first place to look. If you have a lot of wind or tidal, then, you know, those are other alternatives. The other thing that is extremely important is, you know, making our buildings and our industries and our appliances as efficient as possible. We need to get, you know, as much as we can out of the electricity that we produce. So we need to make sure that those renewables are really working hard for us.
Jill Duggan, Executive Director from the Environmental Defence Fund Europe. Thanks very much indeed for joining us on the Daily Climate Show.
Thank you.
And that's all from us for now. Thanks for watching.